My friends, Francisco Ricardo, October 10th, 2021, Sunday evening. It won't be Sunday very much longer, I'm afraid, as it's just about 11 o'clock. And briefly, we shall start a whole new day. You're living with me right now in a space where what you're watching obviously has been separated in time somewhat from the moment in which it has come about. And at the same time, because we're united in thought and in intention, and also because we have many of the same questions, it would seem, we are somehow linked in the ways that may not be clear in this conversation. This link doesn't begin with this evening and where I am right now in this quiet, or I guess relatively quiet, Burbank night. The planes are taking off and traffic is all around, but that's the world we live in. It's not an uninhabited world. The link, in fact, actually begins much, much further. Whenever we impose on ourselves the idea of connecting with the important questions which have the potential to define us and to redefine us, to give meaning to the world in which we live and questions that we have, to bring us from one place to the next, no matter how small that movement may appear to be, then we are speaking not only of the moment that comes now, or perhaps a memory of a moment that came earlier, or perhaps of a reading of a book or a text that came much, much earlier, but in fact, we are once again continuing, as it were, the litanious conversation whose theme goes back to time immemorial. So, if you want to step out of time, if you want not to live in today, if you want to avoid the weariness that comes with the aging of your existence and the things to which you feel you must have some inevitable resistance in order to beat the day and to stand up to the challenges that are coming, then you must find a way to connect yourself with the timeless. The timeless begins not in a obviously moment when it's called up, as it were. The timeless has no beginning. It is a stream that is running in a brook next to the path that we have chosen to walk, except that this brook doesn't begin on earth, as it were. It begins somewhere else, and it crosses through every known landmass of this globe and continues thereafter in other lands, in other places, and in other realms. So, since the thematic of the universal and the infinite is timeless, then the closeness that we have to it as a theme is exactly what we do, what we can do in order to achieve that timelessness in some degree. Now, of course, your body's not going to become timeless. The aging process has already begun, and genetically determined as it is, will never end until such time as, in some way, what remains of our body will go back to the earth, right? And then in itself, it will engender other forms of life and other material service to this planet. When we think about material things, what happens is that we are becoming aligned with and we subscribe to the passing elements, the elements whose material nature causes them to be mortal and time-worthy, and therefore they are in constant change, but it's a change which, even though at the very beginning may appear to be following the spark of creative explosion, in fact are always dying. Because everything that begins must have an ending. And we've heard this many times, and we've seen it in many places. But that corollary that it invites is the one in which whatever doesn't begin doesn't have an end. And so to call up ideas, concepts, questions, to explore in your spirit certain timeless topics means that, in a way, what you're connecting with is the part of the existence that you share with everything else, which has no sense of aging, of falling apart, of decrepitude. The thing that people want very much is to preserve the youth of their life. And yet, what do? They don't think about timeless things. They worry about what's visibly here. You can think of all of the noise in the world as a kind of train passing by in the same way as we're having this train. The force of being here, the physical sensation, all of the loudness, all of the substance, all of the motion, the way that it moves the energy. That is the pure and inarguable stuff of physical presence. Before I lived here next to this train, I lived in Massachusetts next to another train. And before then, elsewhere in the Northeast, I was near another train. It just seems as if one can't live very far from a train. But for all of the, I guess, transportation media and methods that there are out there, for me the train is by far the most powerfully immediate. Because as it passes, it moves the energy, declares itself, forces you to think about it. And when you think about the train, what you're actually thinking about is a kind of conquest of land, of peace, of space, in exchange for the motion of materials from one place to the next. The most powerful transportation medium that is land-bound is in fact the train. And for a lot of people, there are many more metaphors of trains than there are of airplanes and of boats and of horses, etc. The train always has this power, this speed, and this inevitable notion in which, as it's moving, it's pushing things out of its way. That's not something we can say about an airplane, and it certainly isn't really something we can say about a boat. Boats bob about in the water without a real anchor. They may have an anchor, but they certainly aren't moving with that anchor. So these other elements, air and water, are really the things that rule, that control, that surround, that constrain, and that condition what the airplane and what the boat will become. However, the train itself lands on the earth with a kind of weight that cannot be denied. It's the heaviest thing that actually moves. And the earth, in a way, has to be prepared for it. It's not like the air has to be prepared for a plane or the water to be prepared for a boat, but you can't just put a train on the ground. You have to prepare the tracks and make sure that there's solidity under the ground, because the train will go right through it. And in many ways, for me, every time I feel the train and I see the train going by, I think of things that the train itself has become a kind of narrative symbol of. The first and most popular version of what this train symbolizes is progress. perhaps because it was born during the Industrial Revolution, and its ability to move things without care, unlike a boat or an airplane, where gusts of wind or storms on the water can certainly threaten the navigation path of those other two objects. The train can go through virtually anything, except obviously some sort of tornado, and will make sure that as it declares itself with a horn, it just gets through from one place to the next. And it says in a kind of plaintive wail, "I'm coming." Well, that's what life is for me. When I think of what the train is doing, it's a notion of the life of someone going through the generational phases, beginning with all of that enthusiasm and love coming at you that you don't know what to do when you have it with children, for instance. And then the, I guess, almost unstoppably irrepressible energy of youth and adolescence that leads in itself to perhaps the establishment of careers and further significant life paths that come in the 20s and 30s, and the establishment of those further on in a kind of institutional permanence in the 40s and 50s. And then perhaps later, if you believe in the Ericksonian model of the 7 stages of life, eventually coming to some sort of generativity in the 70s and 80s, maybe the late 60s, depending on how precocious and what kind of culture you happen to live in. But all of these passages and all of these, I suppose, points of transformation that the train itself represents are something that I believe we need to embrace as models of our own life. What becomes clear is that we do run out of fuel and we get tired. And then over time, our own life begins to resemble not so much a train, but perhaps a feather. We are vulnerable to many things, and we are unclear, perhaps in some ways unsure whether we should even go forward. One of the things that comes with age is the conviction that perhaps you've done all you need to do, and should you be involved in this other new project, should you be embracing entirely novel directions, new things with other people, or should just perhaps would it be best to reach that point in life when you accept it as something that, okay, now I'm tired, I've done my part, let others pick up the baton and run with it. These are the worries of ages. These are the worries of generational transitions about which so much has been written. Because when I grew up, there was I guess, if you like, a kind of almost heart-stopping message, which in Manhattan, when I would cross around 33rd, 34th Street, I would see, when I would walk past the Central Post Office, an enormous Greco-Roman building in the west side of Manhattan. And as you walk past it, with its columns and seemingly endless and outsized steps, you could look up at the colonnade and see this biblical, but at the time I'm sure many people like myself didn't know it was biblical, saying, carved in this serif font that is deep and authoritative. And it says, "What is man that thou art mindful of him?" And I was just like, okay. I have two observations about that. It never occurred to me to ask, what it is that we are, what significance is our life, that someone deigns to have the expectation that God, such as God may be, should be aware and caring for us. That seems a bit pretentious almost from the human's perspective. So the question of what is man that thou art mindful of him is a question to ask God, to say the imperfections, the contradictions, the betrayals, the inconsistencies, the conflicts, the incompletions, the confusion, all of these energies which create the angry condition of humans everywhere do not seem to a rational mind to add up to a being worthy of mindfulness by another greater being or intelligence. And so the Bible, as it often is so good at doing, asks, obviously, of God that some degree of consideration be given for this pea-brained human being encased in quickly dying flesh and acting out in ways that are not in keeping with scripture and expectation of his own very highest good on this planet while he is here. This human is, if nothing, if not some sort of disappointment in the long run. And to me, when I run into that question as I'm walking by, I think the first time I saw it, I must have been 14, 15 years old. What is man that thou art mindful of him? That was the first interrogative moment when I could objectify myself before something else that was so much greater that it had to put me into a kind of perspective. And then the second thing that happens with that particular phrase, as you ponder, you think, you reflect on it, is that it is a question that can only come to someone who is neither God nor man, but instead is someone who is no longer in the condition of man, living mindlessly in the pursuit of the mundane impulses that rule his everyday. But rather, it is the question, and they are the words of someone who has taken enough effort of reflection to be able to step aside and to look at the human condition as a whole, and in the objective sense, then direct itself to the greater entity that surrounds us and whose energy we practically live off of, and deigns to ask it something along the lines of, look at this pitiful thing. Why are you caring for it? And so for me, both of those moments of reflection, on the first hand, I guess, a consideration of the pitiable condition that I and many humans around are in, and it seems perpetually. And secondarily, the question of how, even with great considerate reflection, a person can reach only perhaps enough of a state to be able to abstract himself from the rest of the human condition and look upon it. And having seen that distance and understood from the outside, as it were, the true predicament that humans have put themselves into, can then ask naturally of the greater intelligence, why it would seem to the greater intelligence that we are deserving of any attention and any consideration and care at all. And of course, if you like, then you can think about the third part, which is that the question itself brings to light the inevitability that we are being mindful, that we are being minded over by this greater intelligence, that we cannot exist by mere dint of our own wits, because our wits are really at wit's end. War is a continual and constant condition on Earth in one place or another. The corruption of public administration and the act of governance in small and in regional and in national and even in transnational governmental coalitions is so poor that one wonders how anyone can be fed, how anyone's needs can be met at all. And the inconsistencies in our own heart concerning how we see our brethren are so profound and biased, and so intolerant, and so selfish, that it is very hard to put all of this together. 1, 2, and 3, the three sides of the question, such as I'm presenting to you. And then say, is there any hope in all of this? What can I do? But by beginning to reflect upon this, you actually begin to get back to the point of departure that I was speaking about, which is that there is the possibility of doing one thing. Certainly, if you don't feel, and I think justifiably so, that you can change anything right now, because you're just approaching a kind of sincere understanding of the predicament that you're in, the difficulties in really changing anything from a real and permanent perspective, since we have no real control of ourselves and we're reacting to everything around us on a continual basis. And of course, we are continuing to service this ego illusion of who we are in ourselves, that somehow must be enforced, must be maintained, must be seen to be this great and inalienably integral force in the planet, whose presence is indispensable and has the name of John Doe or whatever your name is. Since we are in that condition, since we are in this world, then what we really can only do is to observe. We can't change anything until such time as we can understand how difficult it is to get a kind of game plan for change. My friends, I am not one of those optimistic people who feels that by self-help books, by taking some master class, by a weekend in some kind of spiritual encounter, your life is going to change. Because these are the necessary crutches to spiritual education. But you must, at the end of the day, begin to understand yourself from a perspective of seeing before changing. And then the commitment to change has to come to you on a completely different set of conditions. Those conditions, of course, are born in the seed of hope. But the pathway, the roadmap to transcendence under new conditions that make it possible for you to realize long-term change can only come when you leave the notion of the train, the phenomenon whose senses or which inhabit and assault your senses and has a kind of physical presence here that as a train can be symbolized in many ways by almost anyone. The wealthy billionaire, the big political, the oligarch, the powerful politician, as I say, the leader of any kind, the boss at work. Any person that you can imagine is that train. And you marvel in some ways, or you fear, or you respect the penumbra that is cast from the light of that person or those people or that culture, because it is here, because it is earthbound. But being earthbound, it is like the train. It comes and goes. No matter how powerful it is, it's no longer here. See, it's gone. The metaphor of this train passing by every day continues to remind me that no matter how powerful the conditions of perhaps war or famine or corruption or disorganization that I live in, and regardless of the fact that another wave or another train will be coming along at some point soon, the only way that I can really find solace in the greatness that is before me toward the next moment is to understand that it is in passing. And if I wanted to then focus on the strength that I can draw from anything in this world, then it has to be from things that aren't passing, not things that are strong. Things that are strong and here, like a forest, are bound to burn, are bound to die, are bound to change. If I want the real strength, if I want the real deal, I have to go beyond that. And this is why things without a beginning and things without an end, such as the conversation that we're beginning at the start of this small transmission for you, are things that tap into the mother lobe of this endless conversation that thousands of years ago, and hundreds of thousands of years ago, I dare say, were the basis of considerations for the possibility of evolution of human potential. And that in having these discussions and these mentations, we are going to be able to change small bits of today and perhaps small elements and aspects of tomorrow. But the importance is that the more we continue to think about that stream of thought, and the more we partake of it, the more we are living in the timeless. And so picking up this conversation in your own mind and carrying it with you throughout the day, throughout the evening, throughout the week, means that while you do so and for as long as you do so, you are drinking from the tributary of the timeless. And that has a way of rubbing off, because that timeless water will nourish you in a way that wherever it reaches, thirst shall not return. That's what I think we need to do. We have to talk about topics that, spiritually speaking, have no beginning anywhere. I would even say that this conversation has probably been one that comes to us from some other spiritual domain, perhaps even long before the earth was inhabited by human souls. Because we don't know where the spirit comes from, but we know it wasn't born here. My friends, Francisco Ricardo, have timelessness in your week. Drink from the waters of the timeless. Think carefully about these topics and subject matter that bring you out of the moment and bring you beyond your own understanding of your physical and sensory self. Because as you do so, and the more that you do so, the more that you then begin to embody the timeless in some part of yourself. And I think that not only that's a worthwhile journey, but if you work with me, that's where I'm going. Until next time, be well and many blessings.